the Okta hack is it seems within, IT administrators, right? This was that they went after some sort of IT administrator type of account. And I think there definitely needs to be some better controls around who's actually resetting this. And I actually recently even heard about, and I feel like social engineering is just making a comeback at this point, right? I have fished a CISA before in my own internal company. Now it was a little bit more elaborate, but I was able to get him to click. I've gotten the security 50% of the security team to click on it using food as a fish, as a lure to get them to click on stuff. So everyone's fishable. I will tell you, I've clicked on my own phishing email that I approved for my team because it was just so long. It was a busy time. I fell for it. But getting back to social engineering and calling into a help desk, the Okta. There was an Okta. Okta recently came out with it, and I feel like this has been Okta just having incident after incident, right? That there's been a couple other ones. There's been one last year, but in this case, someone called and breached the customer support system. Initially, they thought it was 1%. At the end of November, they came back and said every customer, not federal users, because they were on a different system, but every other customer had their information stolen, name and email address. That doesn't seem like a lot, but going back to tying the phishing back in, a lot of those Okta users are going to be IT administrators, and that's I feel like the world has definitely gone identity, right? Identity is huge right now because if you get access to an environment, then you and especially IT administrator, you have a lot of power within that environment.
And this is particularly challenging when one of the things, obviously, on the insurance side that is an absolute requirement is MFA, right? And so when we start looking at privileged access management, identity and access management, and the recommendation to use those controls, and yet you have an organization that's being breached, I think about this a lot, and I just shudder because I'm like, well, how do we even help our insured constituency manage their own challenges when these are the types of issues being faced by these organizations that are providing those services?
Yeah, no, and that's, going back to the security awareness use case. I mean, those are the types of considerations that you would make as a part of the processes and procedure that you put in place, Brian, to your point, to manage those risks and establish those controls. Privileged access, both in the Okta breach as well as in the MGM breach and a litany of others, really would have, at a minimum, raised the privilege escalation far sooner and enabled responders to react faster and contain more of what was going on. And it quickly becomes a conversation on the cyber insurance side where, well, why are we not focusing more on this from an underwriting perspective? And why are we not focusing on identity within security frameworks, which often I think, while they are great, well-intentioned, and academically extremely sound, no matter how you slice it, I think what's often missing from security awareness, or not security awareness, but security frameworks in general, and control architectures is, that practical last mile. Like so we've implemented all these controls, we have all these things we're measuring, on the risk side of things and within the security team, this is all crystal clear. But now how do we take that and translate it into those policy and procedure changes and the business facing side of that conversation? And in the case of Okta, the presence of those things could have prevented this from ever escalating to the way that it did. And that, I think, is, Brian, to the point, many of the points you made and Kirsten that you made, kind of the heart of the matter. And no one is really talking about it that way, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I go back to I'm going to refer to naze, the Japanese term for ask why 5 times and get to the root cause. Mm-hmm. And when they talked about Okta, they blamed that on an employee who saved his credentials for a server account in I think it was his personal Google account, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to assume how that was saved there, right? Whether it was saved in the browser, whether he just saved it somewhere, right? And I'm not going to sit here and say that, well, if you would have had a password manager, right, then that solves all problems. We've seen what's happened with LastPass and a few others, but that's why those companies become targets, is because those are additional keys to the kingdom, right? And if you're one of the people that work for the company that carries keys of the kingdom from an identity side, and you're storing your credentials somewhere where you shouldn't be storing them, that's what people are looking for is keys to get into your kingdom, to get into other people's kingdoms. So when you ask, what was the root cause? Because I'm sure and I've seen it, a million companies that have come out with, this is how we would have solved that. This is how we would have done that. Yeah, but those are all over here on the right side, right? After the fact, you would have seen this or stopped that. But that root cause of that person, right, and his credentials and his Google account being compromised, and they found it, and then they used it, and then they got in, and then from there it escalated. I also look at this too as, how can you come out and say, well, it only affected 1%, and then come out several weeks later and say, we were off. It was 97. Sorry, I looked at the wrong number, or 99%. The 1% was, it didn't happen. The 99% was, it did. I also looked at, there was a little bit of a lack of transparency there for a few weeks. And I've seen that in forum chats with other peers of mine that have really talked about that. And that's where you start to lose credibility as a business.
So I was reading a Wall Street article on that recently about the fact that, could it be that these new rules in place that people have to report on a breach within an X amount of time, and those rules haven't necessarily kicked in. They're supposed to, we're getting pretty close to those rules kicking in this month, but like, is that going to cause even more misinformation going forward?
And I'm going to jokingly say this, it's the total opposite of a sales guy, where it's like shoot high and then come low. Now it's shoot low and gently go high, right? As you begin to discover more. I think there's a lot of truth around what you just said, that because of the timing that you have to report, a lot of times you won't have all that information readily available at that immediate time of, hey, it's due today. It's due right this minute.
Well, and that even starts to talk about what is reasonable. And from a disclosure perspective, and anyone that's spoken with cyber counsel or somebody who has an expertise in privacy law is going to tell you that that timetable typically doesn't start until you have firm forensic conclusions in most legal jurisdictions and regulations. That's of course not a blanket statement, but a majority of them, that's kind of when the timetable starts. And I think that's also not a well understood data point in terms of people considering the impacts of those disclosures and communications that need to happen inside of their incident response plan and program. And that's, that's something that should be arising to the executives and board level and be discussed ahead of those things happening. But frequently it's not. And I think ultimately that's what leads to these kind of, ready and fire situations like we saw with Okta and what they disclosed. And we've seen it a lot in the past too, but that's really symptomatic, I think, of a lack of continuity in that conversation across those executive teams.
Yes, absolutely.
If anyone else wants to jump in there too, feel free to add more fuel, because I was going more also on the speculation side of when we talked earlier about putting friction in place. If you have more workers working from home, and this is an assumption, so I hate to even use it, but now imagine that you work for a tech company and you can work from wherever it is you want, right? Not that's a blanket statement, but if said individual is working remotely and traveling here, traveling there, sometimes doesn't have access and says, okay, I'm going to put my credentials here in this account so I have access to it because that's what I need to do my job, right? Again, it comes down to that awareness training and that process failure mode analysis for the people that work for your company who have access to those infrastructure that you guys support for all of your clients, right? So just putting a control in place that is a blanket statement that thou shall not do this. How do you control that, right? So I think there's definitely some conversations that have probably gone on behind closed doors there for Okta and how that was handled.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what really starts to become interesting about that is the fact that so many, like if anyone who has done this type of consulting work with any number of businesses ranging from small to very large knows that is a common industry-wide problem right now, right? Like no one outside of, I would say, the exceptions that are out there is really tackling that in a concrete and consistent, well thought out way. And I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of the tension that exists between security teams and business teams kind of broadly and has culturally for a long time because of the nature of the relationship between those two organizations within any business. And that even is kind of further compounded by, the situations or kind of scapegoating type of behavior that we've seen from some executive teams relative to their CISOs. They're not necessarily working as a team to resolve and set the stage for those circumstances to be successful when that stuff does happen, Brian, to your point. And very often it becomes combative or, a finger pointing exercise. And that ultimately doesn't protect the organization any better. And it certainly doesn't protect the third parties for whom that organization maintains any kind of sensitive or critical data.
Yeah, I think you're going to constantly have that. I mean, it's just in any business, the nature of like regulating the business and the compliance aspect of the business is always going to be almost directly combating, the profitability and the marketability and, the fluidity of that business's operations, right? So you're just going to continually have that battle back and forth. And I think a big part of the problem, with something like this, I mean, obviously, clearly that awareness continues to be a serious issue there, but also even in that disclosure and that reporting, Okta probably has people in place that understand all of this, but you got to take businesses and other industries and other verticals that the person completing these reports or going through these compliance exercises may have no understanding of technology and IT and cybersecurity. And I mean, what does that lead to as far as like the accuracy of that reporting and disclosure going forward? So again, I think it's just a matter of, as you said, like those teams really need to come together and, maybe for the first time in some of these other industries, bring the compliance and the security folks, on board with the business development team and, put these processes in place. Because there's only, so many industries that already have that kind of compliance structure in place. And again, I think it's going to have to be, widespread for everybody at some point. So.
I completely agree.
So I feel like there's a topic here that as far as, because I feel like we've talked about friction between different groups, and to me it's also almost like a user experience type of thing. And I feel like nowadays we have this initiative to get rid of passwords. So I don't know what people's thoughts about getting rid of passwords and going to something more like a hardware token. FIDO and all that kind of technology that I think is getting a lot more mature, and to me is a viable option and solves a lot of these problems. Now it creates new problems, but I wonder what your all's thought on that is.
I mean, my dad's not working anymore, but I can't even get him to use a password manager. But the amount of time it took people to start recognizing the value in a password manager, and then you start to get them onboarded on that, I see a ton of value right out the gate in a password manager. But I do agree where you were going with that statement. I'd be interested to hear everybody else's commentary on FIDO. This is another one of those chat forum discussions that you get a lot of great feedback on from practitioners and where they see it going. Even Microsoft's been working behind the scenes on passwordless, and there are a lot of importance behind it. And I think part of it is getting people at the executive level to trust it, right? And with that, it needs to be explained to them in layman's terms. And I think that's the starting point.
I think they're very viable solutions. But I mean, if you remember like our RSA tokens that we used to use and those types of things, and oh my gosh, I left mine at home, or, it's like there's always this continual thing about, trying to put those things in place. The thing that I hear the most from practitioners, though, is that it's the executives who are their biggest offenders when it comes to things like MFA or those, and it's terrible. And they're like, just turn off MFA for me to make everybody else use it. And it's like, but you're the one who's the most targeted. No, it has to be the other way around. And so it is a big thing that, this need for organizations to take security seriously as part of their business mission, kind of back to our other discussion, because I think partly people will do what's asked of them. And as we were discussing earlier, part of it is explain to them the implications of not, and not feeling like it's just such a pain, right? And I actually like the MFA because it makes me feel like, oh, I'm doing good things, right? And so I think it's, but also I understand why, and I think that the big part of it is getting the executive suite to understand why it is so critical and how they're the leaders in all senses of leading their organizations to take these things seriously, and why it is critical to their business mission to do so.
I couldn't agree more, and I think there's a couple opportunities for advancement and progress on as an outcome of those discussions, and I think it's that it draws back to the theme of security is not a one size fits all conversation. It's not even that within the same organization at different levels of the organization, you're not going to use the same controls and risk mitigation measures for executives that you would use for IT admins or developers, because they just fundamentally have different levels of access. There's a different level of risk, and there's a different not only mindset but operational impact to those things. And so from an insurance perspective, what I think is interesting, and I believe this is why policies on executives and especially CISOs we've seen kind of evolving over the last 12 months as a result of this, because I think what's going to end up happening on the insurance side of that is, one, those top officers and key officers within even the technology or security teams may need different forms of coverage that augment existing, like cyber policies or other things that would cover these specific use cases. But coming back down to protecting individual liability and individual legal or regulatory impact on some of those practitioners, and I think there'll be a bifurcation of those things over time. What I think is interesting about that is, it really puts a higher emphasis to the points that you all made kind of through this segment of the discussion. Identity is such an important thing to manage, it's we have some really advanced and great ways of doing it, but we have not seen unilateral adoption of all of those things, especially things like FIDO2, Tim, to your point, across organizations, because some of it is just emerging and so new, and only just now becoming viable to deploy at scale in those ways. And then kind of the final takeaway that I have from all of this, and really all the topics that we've discussed, and Tim, this may be a good segue into kind of the next topic, but I think threat modeling at the business level, and not necessarily at a deep technical level, but looking at those business outcomes, looking at the operational controls, and what the actual risk profile and attack surface of some of these unique use cases or individuals that could be targeted. Those things become all that much more important as we start to translate this into that business conversation and escape the conversation about technical security controls.